So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Randall Bowie, I should say. He grew up in the US and in Europe, but he has European roots. His initial degree in economics and chemistry is from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and then his PhD is from the University of Stockholm, where he married a Swedish wife and became a Swedish citizen. So he's worked for many, many years for ministries of the finance, industry, and energy in the Swedish Energy Agency before joining the EU DG on energy and transport, then called DG 17. Of course, as you all know, this organization is now changing on a daily basis, and he just told me that the final location of this was decided yesterday. So anyhow, it's a great pleasure to have you here. He was one of the driving forces at the commission behind the Buildings Directive, the Energy End-Use Efficiency and Energy Services Directive, and the Energy Efficiency Action Plans. In 2007, he left the commission for a chief consultancy position at Rockwool Internationals, currently stationed in Denmark and in Brussels. And just before this, introducing him, we were talking about how there's a little bit of a conviction, and certainly reflected in Al Gore's recent book, that maybe the best way to save the planet is to give people a chance to make some money while saving the planet. So that probably reflects your move from.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. What I would like to do in the 20 minutes or so that I have is to give sort of a perspective on what's happening in the EU, in the building area, starting with a general description of what's happening in the EU as a whole, and working down through efficiency, sustainability, and eventually getting into regulations and buildings. To start, I can say that my interest in this area is because I was heavily involved in the writing of these laws in the EU, in the Commission, and which were adopted by the institutions after many years of difficult negotiations. There is a lot happening now. But if we go back a few years, we'll see that things were not always this clear. There has been some opposition to getting regulations, and especially efficiency regulations, through the institutions. I might mention that, and at the end I'll go into a little detail on the new treaty which is coming up, which will impact on the way that we work in Europe as far as EU legislation, the Lisbon Treaty. I'm sure you've heard of the Lisbon Treaty, which was finally ratified. It took a few turns to make that happen, but it seems to be a fact now, and this will affect us too. I think as far as buildings, it's important to keep in mind that the EU is built up on the concept of subsidiarity. It's allowing the member states to do things a lot according to their own national requirements. So there's a pull between what should be decided in Brussels and what should be decided by the member states, subsidiarity. As far as buildings, through the years, the culture of buildings, the local the climatic differences, the local building culture has led to the fact that most member states were very jealous. They wanted to protect the right to decide on their own building codes and building standards, and even the levels of efficiency. I think what has happened there is issues like climate change, security of supply, but even some macroeconomic considerations such as employment have come in and given a reason for the politicians in Brussels to move the center of gravity closer to Brussels. So this is a tug of war, and I think it's moving rapidly, or more and more rapidly, in the direction of concentrating a bit more of that power in Brussels and allowing more regulations. But the thing to remember, though, is that there is still the general principle of writing directives which allow member states to decide a lot of the details. So these are giving orders on what to do, but not how to do it. But then once you agree it, the member states transpose this into framework laws, so-called primary legislation, which are in turn put into regulations, secondary legislation. They have to be applied, and then control is a big issue, and I noticed that was mentioned several times today. Compliance, we've discovered that that's an area where you can save almost as much as with changing technologies if you increase compliance. And the infringement procedures are something that the Commission has. It's a power of, if they're not doing what they're supposed to, they can be taken to court and they can be fined. This is a process that's increasing, and it does have some effect. But if they have no real control system in place, it can be difficult to make a court case. But if they don't apply or don't try to do the regulation, there is sufficient power in the treaty to take them to court. There's some new changes now which will make it force them to do more on compliance. I can say that as far as earlier measures in the EU, they were not too successful. And I'll mention a few details. Back in the early 90s, there were attempts in buildings to have legislation, but they didn't work that well. And finally, there is sustainability is an area in buildings which is only now, really now becoming a focus. Before it was the use phase of energy. But recently now you're getting into a lot of discussion on embedded energy and the cradle-to-cradle type of life cycle analysis. But this is a pretty recent development, although I'm sure it's been there in the heads of a lot of people in DG Environment, in the Environment Directorate, but it's only now that it's coming up to the surface and they're putting it into law, or trying to. The first, and I was a bit involved in this piece of legislation too, but then I was working for the Swedish government, and this was before I went to the Commission. But the first piece of legislation on buildings was a so-called SAVE Directive in 1993, which, interesting enough, gave a lot of the same areas to operate in as you see today. One was certification of buildings, individual heating, the precursor to smart metering, financial requirements like third-party financing, and then thermal insulation and then regular inspection of boilers. However, the thing to remember is that this was back in the period when they were trying to liberalize the markets. Nobody wanted regulations. So they said, let the member states decide. We give them the order to do programs. And they decided that was it, that would be enough, and then market would take care of it. Unfortunately, nothing happened, or very little happened as a result of this directive. Member states did token programs, but very few of them took very drastic measures. Okay. But what happened as a result of that was that it was finally withdrawn. They withdrew this directive, repealed it. But during the period, in the beginning of the 90s, there was a tendency not to spend too much time on trying to do more detailed prescriptive regulations, or even regulations at all. There we go. One of the things that's very important to keep in mind, too, is the way the Commission and the institutions work. You have white papers, which will often decide. This is similar to the UK system, and I think even in the US to a certain extent. There is a period of consultation, a period of public consultation, a so-called green paper with ideas, and then finally a white paper. In energy efficiency and the ones that affected buildings, these are often in terms of an action plan, energy efficiency action plan. There have been two, and there's a third one now in the process of being prepared. But in these action plans and these white papers, you do get the core ideas of a lot of legislation. One was the fact that there would be national action plans for energy efficiency, and that was recently enacted in a piece of legislation called the Energy Services Directive. It also requires, or tried to require, a savings target. I don't know if you're familiar with all the targets in the EU, but they have often something they call the 20-20-20, where 20% renewables share by 2020, a CO2 reduction of 20% by 2020, perhaps 30 if they can reach agreement in Copenhagen, an international agreement, then they would revise that to 30%. And then the one little remaining 20 was energy efficiency. However, this was never made a binding target. The others are actually legally binding requirements, and they can lead to penalties if they're not. But for some reason, efficiency was not made a binding target. Now there's a big debate to try to make it, and but they're just trying to figure out the best way to measure it, baseline, there are arguments, maybe even a pure consumption target, energy intensity target. There are different approaches, but they're trying desperately now to find a way to have a binding savings target. These action plans also tried to push the idea of setting EU-wide building codes, or setting them in Brussels, by taking into account different climate zone differences. This idea, after many so-called impact assessments have to be carried out for every piece of legislation, said that this would be very, very difficult. But there is something that was recently adopted, and I'll get into that in a minute, which allows member states to calculate on a life cycle analysis basis with net present values, a so-called cost optimal benchmark, and compare that to their building codes. And I'll give a little illustration soon. This was actually adopted or agreed on the 17th of November in the so-called trialogues. These are informal meetings between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, where they agreed. This is an informal agreement which will be formally agreed at the ministerial level on the 7th of December, which is also the beginning of COP15. And that was the reason for setting that date, because the EU wanted to show at the beginning of COP15 that they had done a substantial piece of legislation. And as someone from industry now, formerly with the Commission, I can say that it's a fairly good piece of legislation. That's my own. It's an improvement over previous legislation, and I'll try to illustrate that too. But these action plans, getting back these white papers, they also included requirements for increased standardization, like for energy audits, energy management. This is a process which is also ongoing, and the number of EU-level standards is increasing, and they are being applied by the member states. One of the big discussion points has been financing, which is as far as renovations, we all know it's a difficult area, upfront financing, but that has been partially addressed in this new legislation. And the new area is working directly with the local governments and the municipalities, and sort of bypassing the national governments, which is something that worries the national governments a bit. They prefer to go through them rather than going to the local level. But there is now agreement that they will be doing quite a few programs where the local governments are benefited directly from activities in Brussels. The first piece of legislation on buildings was the so-called the EPBD, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive 2002. What I've been speaking of earlier is the revision, which is now being adopted on the 17th of November, of this directive. It's called a recast. But the first directive on buildings in 2002 had essentially 5-6 basic elements, which were fairly good, but they left a great deal to the member states, a very great deal of subsidiarity. which created a bit of a problem because some of them did very good jobs. They transposed the legislation very well and they implemented it very well. Others did almost nothing at all. I have to admit also that some of the new member states, they actually had reasons to take more time. Even though they had signed up to doing it fairly quickly, they soon discovered, some of the Eastern European countries, that it's pretty complicated to do some of this legislation. So you see a lot of, in the new member states, areas where they haven't done too much with the building codes, unfortunately, or with building efficiency in general. But this directive had essentially the following elements. It told the member states to look at an annex in this directive and use that to calculate. And it's in the annex, it's essentially listed a number of elements like thermal insulation, air tightness. It told them to take into account the positive influence of renewables and to calculate the energy performance of buildings in a holistic and an integrated fashion. So that was sort of the first time that the EU told the member states sort of how to do their codes. It told them that they should do it in an integrated fashion. And it told them that they had to start applying minimum requirements. Most of them did already have some type of requirements, but it also told them that they had to review these and, if necessary, change them every 5 years. So it does try to force them to move ahead. It gave them the possibility of using the integrated calculation methodology or choosing components. But since they're already required to do the holistic calculation, the component, individual elements like the U values of walls, roofs, and so forth, that was sort of a complement to the holistic calculation methodology. And then it did require them to do certification of buildings, so-called energy labels, when they renovated a house or sold it, or when it was constructed. And then the public sector was required to display these labels. And finally, there was a requirement on inspection of boilers and air conditioning systems. Well, this thing keeps going backwards, but there. Okay, what I'd like to say here is that up to the point of about 2 years ago, before this final piece of legislation was enacted, there were a lot of discussions ongoing. And one, or some of the most important ones, were the fact that there was a huge amount of variation in the member state codes. And they wanted a way to get at in Brussels, those who worked with efficiency wanted to find a way to improve the lower building code levels, the member states with bad codes, without jeopardizing those who already had good codes. And they did this not by setting or proposing to set code levels for all the member states. They realized that would be almost impossible. But they did develop this so-called cost optimal methodology, which is, for the first time, it's based on a life cycle cost. And the beauty of this is that it actually moves away from this so-called payback period where you often look for very quick 4-year paybacks. It forces the member states to do a benchmarking where they take the full life, the service life of a building, and calculate that as the benefit, the investments in that as a benefit. So you get quite a different result. And this strongly influences low energy buildings, the net present value of low energy buildings. Unfortunately, there was an attempt to include a lot of externalities in this calculation, but the member states fought that. So this is mainly based on a private economic cost optimal calculation methodology. But it does require them to take into account energy prices and even future energy prices. The discussion in the panel today about writing codes for the future as being a bit risky. The EU is going almost in that direction where they're planning to give advice on what they expect energy prices and cost to be for at least the world market. Of course, they'll vary between member states. Those member states who have a lot of biofuels, when the fossil prices are going up, of course, we'll have different energy prices. But taking that into account, the EU will try to give guidance on the long-term price development, which of course affects the cost optimal, calculate the life cycle cost of an investment and of a code. Another area was that low energy buildings. These action plans had decided that there should be work done on low energy buildings. So this directive, which was recently adopted, has included a requirement for low energy buildings. They debated many months about what the definition was, because each member state has its own definition. But they finally agreed on nearly zero energy buildings as the common definition. And I'll give you the definition in a few minutes. One area which I think was failing in this new legislation was the existing building, the deep renovations. There is a big fear now in Europe that when the renovation starts, there will be a lot of renovation projects. They're not required by this directive, but I think there you have the market forces working. There's a fear that there will be a lot of cherry picking and cream skimming, that they will not go all the way down into deep renovations. However, this cost optimal may help, at least on the building codes, on the new building side, to make them at least consider going into deeper renovations. Before this legislation was adopted, there was this discussion of holistic versus elements. This directive did finally require both. There was a lot on financing, which, like I said, was partially addressed. Quite a bit of discussion on the use of, asset values as opposed to actual consumption. The European Parliament tried very hard to include that in the directive, but it was not really addressed. However, some member states are trying to do it. Sweden, for example, has now passed a law where they will measure energy consumption for 2 years in buildings which have been certified, and they'll compare it to the certification of a new build. This is a new build. And then they'll compare the actual with the expected, the diagram that was shown. And then we asked the Swedish government what will happen then, and they said this could lead to civil cases. I mean, you could sue the builder. And the thing is, the Swedish government doesn't yet know what they will do with this, whether it could be used in civil cases, but it probably will be. So, but this is most of the member states are still basing a lot of it on asset values. They're not going into the metered or the actual use. But I think we're seeing a tendency to go more and more into including the use, the metered value of buildings, and to compare that to the design or expected use. And finally, the thing that was an issue at the time was sustainability. This is being addressed partially in another series of directives. I won't go into detail there, but they call it the sustainable construction or sustainable consumption and production, and then sustainable industrial production. That's that SCP, SIP. This is the GG environment, which worked very hard to put together a number of proposals for revising existing legislation in eco-labeling, the so-called eco-design directive, which is a minimum requirements directive, which is working very well, but to expand that to include not only the use phase, but all energy-related products, which is quite a dramatic change. And then the energy labeling directive, which I think we're talking about later, the one that's for appliances, that will also be extended from not only appliances, but things that could affect energy consumption, like like shower heads, even they're talking about insulation materials, windows, things in buildings which could have some impact on energy consumption. Just a quick background to why this cost optimal was included in this directive. These are, like any piece of EU legislation, it was preceded by enormous numbers of studies, one of which was this study on the actual and recommended U values. What happened here was that you see these are heating degree days. There are those which include heating degree and cooling days. And then the U value up here on the y-axis. The blue is this line down here. These are what you get when you carry out a life cycle cost analysis, so-called cost optimal. The existing codes, and this was done on all the member states, covered quite a bit of data. This is where the codes today, the two differences between the red are the upper values and the high, and this is just for the wall. These were done for all the elements. But you see that almost these two actually are questionable data set. But what this says is that almost all of the EU codes are not cost optimal. There were a couple which turned out to be fairly close, and those were in Scandinavia. Denmark and Sweden were very close to being so-called cost optimal because they had taken into account in building codes a lot of externalities. But this was used to argue the case, and it did lead to including in this most recent directive, the EPBD 2, or the recast of the EPBD, this cost optimal article, which will require member states to calculate this line and see how far their codes are from that and to take action. It's a fairly strong requirement, but it's still what they call a benchmarking requirement. They use the calculation to compare it to their existing codes, and if the deviation is more than 15%, then they were required either to explain it to the Commission or to rewrite their codes. This is sort of the idea, and I'm sure you've seen similar diagrams, but what it does, it's a life cycle cost analysis where you take the red down here is the investment cost for insulation. These are the actually installed appliances like the heating systems, the maintenance cost, the actual construction cost, other energy related costs, and you can put in your CO2 taxes, which are becoming fairly common now in Europe. More and more member states are adopting CO2 taxes. If you put all these together, and then this is the energy use here, different uses, lighting, so forth, and you compare different possible investment packages. These are different, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are different. The cost optimal is the one that delivers, is the least cost, so to speak. It's not necessarily the least, this is kilowatt hours per square meter. The actual lowest is over here, but the cost optimal is here, which pushes, but most, and as I'll show in a minute, most of the ones today are way out here. They're very far from the cost optimal level. But this is a typical life cycle cost analysis, which means that the more you invest here in insulation, whatever, efficient heating systems, the more you reduce this white part, which is the energy use. But if you do these calculations, it will show over a longer period. If you take into account the life cycle of each of these investments, it gives quite a different picture of where your investments and where your codes should be, the level of them. And I noticed at a recent presentation in London that somebody from the Rocky Mountain Institute working with this are doing similar types of calculations. So it's apparently something that's catching on or being used even in the U.S. But in Europe now, it's actually being used to develop legislation. But what it amounts to is this is just an illustrative, these are U values. These are costs. These are actually negative costs below here. These are positive costs. This is the investment. You know, the more you invest, the more you will reduce your energy consumption. But then it, you know, with diminishing returns, it becomes flat. But if you add together your total life cycle costs, your investment cost, and the reduced energy, you'll get this curve. And out here, you get the lowest point of your cost optimal. But after looking at the existing codes, most of the ones for existing buildings are way over here. They're much, much higher U values. Even the new codes are suboptimal. They're over here. So with the exception of a few member states, all of them would have to move much closer to this point. So it'd be moving from about here over to here. It's quite a big change in there. And this is just on U values. This is similar for a lot of other areas too. But it shows that if you do a life cycle cost, you will get better or more meaningful and I think more acceptable calculation methods. A few words on the low energy buildings. As I say, the new directive will require new energy or low energy buildings to be a standard, a norm. I'll get into that later, but it's in 2020, all new buildings in the EU will have to be low energy buildings. This is only new build. For the public sector, it's 2 years earlier, it's 2018. But many member states already have something, what they call, or some type of low energy building. As you see here, like the UK, I believe that's the UK, in 2016, they plan to have net zero energy buildings. They're different definitions. They're low energy buildings, they're energy positive buildings, and net fossil free buildings. There are energy neutral buildings, then they're net zero energy building and the zero CO2 net. And they different ways of what you include in them too. So the problem at EU level was to agree on a definition that would encourage all of them to have some type of activity in low energy buildings. And the final definition will be decided now, the details, guidance will be decided in the next year or so with a comitology, with a commission working together with member state experts to give guidelines. But as you see, a lot of member states do have already started, but not all of them. Actually, it's about half. About half of them have, in one way or other, set their codes by gradually tightening codes, like Denmark. This will, by 2020, that brings you down to a very low energy building. Denmark is leading in that area, by the way, and that's one of the reasons I think they're hosting the COP15, and it's probably the reason that the new commissioner for climate, which is just announced a few days ago, will be Connie Hedegaard from Denmark, who was the environment minister in Denmark. But anyway, Denmark has been doing a lot in the low energy building area. But as you see, they gradually tighten codes. That's one way of doing it, so that you get down to low energy levels. About half of them have definitions. Some are NGO definitions, but about a fourth of the EU member states actually have official government definitions of low energy buildings. This sort of illustrates, the main point is that so many are working with low energy buildings. So 9 countries have official, and 7 additional countries have so-called NGO definitions. So it's about half of the EU member states which are clearly recognizing very low energy buildings. These are just some of the different types of low energy buildings, and the differences. Like over here, it's below 15 kilowatt hours per square meter, but it's only for heating needs. The others, it's more. It's including the so-called plug load in some of them. In the German passive house, for example. That's why you get a fairly high figure. The Swiss and the Danish definitions are fairly close as far as the levels and also as far as the definitions. But over the next few years, in committees, they'll try to agree on some principles. But I think what you'll see in the EU is they'll still continue to have different types of definitions, and they'll work around that. These figures are when you add electricity and heat, what coefficient do you use on electricity? Most of them, surprisingly, are very similar. This is determined partly by the energy mix, of course. I think to conclude, say a few words on the things that were actually included. I've already mentioned most of them in this directive, which was agreed. They reduced there is a requirement that if the classification for a renovation was, in the first directive, it only covered buildings over 1,000 square meters. In the new directive, this was abolished. So the definition for renovations now, any requirements having to do with renovations, is suddenly dropped drastically down to about 50 square meters, which means that small individual homes are included. Before they were deliberately excluded, but now they're included. So this is a pretty dramatic change in this legislation. Cost optimality is included, as I said. The near zero energy buildings, there's a definition, and there's all new buildings in 2020 must comply with a national definition of low energy or nearly zero energy buildings. And public sector would be 2 years earlier. So the public sector leads here. The holistic and component requirements. Now, as I said, both are required. You do have to, if you do a partial renovation, you have to have codes or requirements for individual elements. You can't try to calculate only the holistic approach. And the idea here was to both encourage major renovations, but also not miss the opportunity to put in minimum requirements for individual components in case of a small renovation. And then there is a requirement on any renovation which is over 25% of the value of the building or 25% of the surface would fall under special requirements, which means that you have to look into other possible areas to renovate. That means if you're doing if you're insulating and doing the boiler and you're over, that raises you to over 25%, then you're required to look at other possible investments. So it sort of pushes deep renovations. And then the weakness is there is no target there was an attempt to get a target to require member states to choose to renovate a certain percentage of their existing buildings. This was not carried out. There was too much opposition to it. So most of the, at least on very low energy buildings, most of the activity is on new build, unfortunately. But they do say that member states should develop programs to encourage renovating existing buildings to low energy levels, including national targets. So it's an option. Certification requirements are much stronger. They've trying to harmonize them, but they haven't done that. But there are requirements on when you sell a house, you actually have to have a certificate in hand. You actually have to show a buyer that, and you have to advertise. When you sell a house, you have to advertise the certificate. So it's increasing the value of these certificates and the usefulness. And then control and penalties, there are requirements that they do have control systems to check their certificates and their boiler inspections, and that they actually have penalties for non-compliance. This actually very clearly states you will have penalties to ensure compliance. So this is quite a step forward, and I think it will lead to some changes. And as I said before, the measured values will become more important as a result of this legislation. The definition they finally agreed on is quite interesting. It's nearly zero energy building. The Parliament wanted net zero energy building. They could not agree on that because this doesn't fit some of the national definitions. But nearly zero is something they could all accept. But it does address the performance, the heating and cooling demand first, that you have to have a very high performing building, and it's done in accordance with the simple annex in the directive, which holistic, that you take into account about 20 factors, as I mentioned: air tightness, the thermal insulation, the effective heating and cooling systems, so forth. And then once you have that, if you have any energy over, zero energy or any energy requirement, that to a very significant extent would be from renewables. There was an attempt by the Parliament to have on-site renewables, to have energy autonomous buildings. But it was discovered after looking closely that it's pretty difficult in urban areas to do that. So you have to allow nearby, and even the way it's worded, you can use other renewables, but it tries sort of it's a negotiating result where you favor renewables on site, but you are allowed to have other renewables further up the line. So that was the result of much negotiation among 27 member states. One little thing about the costing that was used to get acceptance for low energy buildings, or nearly zero. If you go to zero, your energy costs continue down. However, your total cost, your investment costs, they tend to be, especially if you use a life cycle costing, they're fairly flat. And then when you reach the point where you get rid of your traditional heating system, it drops. But then as you get closer and closer to zero, your total cost tends to go up. So this is sort of an argument for the best can be the enemy of the good type of thing, that sometimes it's better to try to have a very low energy building and not try to go all the way down to zero, because you may end up increasing costs, at least with today's technology. But this is just one, this is an IEA calculation. I'm sure there may be others which may argue that you can go even, that this curve isn't quite that steep. I won't say too much on financing. That was a big issue in the EU. Unfortunately, there's a big bank, the EIB, European Investment Bank, which is about 7 times larger than the World Bank as far as its subscribed loans now. It's a huge bank. They're gearing up, and they're going to have all types of revolving funds. They're going to finance ESCOs. They recently hired 25 new efficiency experts to work with ESCOs. Energy performance contracting is in the pipeline. They are planning in this new action plan on so-called national energy efficiency funds. And there is a discussion ongoing to take from the emissions trading schemes the money from auctioning. As you know, in phase 3 of this emission trading scheme, they will increase the amount of auctioning. that may be earmarked for putting some into national funds, which would be for efficiency. So there are a lot of activities now which I know will be leading to increased liquidity in the efficiency market, which is attracting a lot of venture capital too, because when they see, it's a leveraging effect, when they see something like the EIB, a big bank, coming up, the small venture capitalists will usually join in, so you get a huge leverage effect. They're so-called regional development funds. Now they've changed the rules, and about 4% of these can be used for efficiency. Before it was a couple of percent, so they've doubled that. There are a lot of so-called public-private partnerships, and this covenant of mayors is something that is signed into, it's already working. In the member states, local mayors can sign up to commitments to follow certain guidelines, and it's actually working. The guidelines are developed by the Commission. The idea of smart cities is planned, and it will be carried out. It's the idea of giving a lot of money to those community funding, going to those cities who go beyond codes. Those who are able to meet the minimum requirements and go beyond. And then finally, there is a proposal for a big rollout, which will come in this new action plan, which will probably come next year. It was supposed to have come this year, it got postponed. But this will lead to 15 million renovations by 2020. Unfortunately, this is a low figure because it's roughly just a slight doubling of the present rate of renovation. It could be tripled. You could actually go way beyond that, 30. So the industry will be arguing to increase this. I noticed in the US, the UN Foundation came out with a proposal for 50 million renovations by 2020, which is a bit more ambitious than this. But the point is, as far as funding, there is money available. There's no question about that. Banks have it. There is liquidity in the system, but it's still difficult to access it because of different types of information barriers. A lot of the banks don't know the technical risk. They need help to decide technical risk. That is now being developed. The banks themselves are making alliances, and they're hiring a lot of people. The EIB has a fairly big energy efficiency unit now, working only with efficiency. So they're hiring a lot of experts. I don't know if I'll say too much. The Lisbon Treaty now will change energy efficiency somewhat, but it's a bit unclear because previously most of the EU legislation was adopted under Article 175, which is an environment article. It meant member states can go beyond. They can set minimum requirements which are higher, more stringent than the EU requirements. There is another article, Article 95, which is the internal market, which tries to harmonize all the standards and requirements, and says that no member state can have stricter requirements than the ones set in Brussels. This new article in the Lisbon Treaty is sort of a mixture of the two. So it's a bit, the legal eagles are still trying to decide how this will affect some of the existing building regulation or building legislation. But that's to be continued. That discussion is taking place in Brussels these coming weeks to trying to see if some of the new legislation may have to be slightly amended. Finally, to conclude, sustainability, I said, has not become a big issue yet, but it is. It's on its way to becoming a very big issue. But it was deliberately left out of this energy efficiency legislation because they thought it was too much to handle, too much to have on the same plate at one time. So they took, in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, its use phase. They did not include the life cycle or the embedded energy in this calculation. There are some other directives, sustainable construction, called Sustainable Construction Products Directive, which tries to put sustainability requirements on individual products. There are some standards being developed, but there is no binding sustainability certification requirement. Our CT-SIN, the European standardization body, is working on some calculation methods for sustainability. I can say that LEED and BREEAM are actually being used by industry in the EU quite a bit. And because there is no EU-wide method. And I heard that the BREEAM will actually start adopting some of the calculation methodologies used in the EU. There was a package in 2008 which tried to cover these in a first attempt. Green public procurement, these are all voluntary guidelines on, it's like 14,001, the standardization for compliance with environmental methodologies in industry. Eco labeling, which is it's a voluntary requirement. The last two, eco design and energy labeling, are actually binding requirements, and as I said, these will be opened up to sustainability. So what's happening now is that there's a movement towards sustainability, where previously it was mainly the use phase of energy. But it's coming, but it'll take a couple of more years. Thank you.
I think we have time just for a couple of questions. Look, there's lots of
two questions. First, where do the life cycle cost optimum calculations come from? And second, related.
There's a small technical issue. We need you to be recorded, so
Yep.
use the microphone.
This works.
I enjoyed your talk. The first question is, where do the life cycle cost optima calculations come from? And the second question related to that is, I believe you said that these calculations are over the lifetime of the building and that they are supposed to represent private optima. Whose private optima?
Okay.
Two questions. In the first Energy Performance Directive, it was focused both on energy certification and building codes. And the member states mostly changed their building codes. And what do you think will be the fate of the energy certification now after the new directive? And then also the first directive focused most on energy efficiency, not so much on on-site renewable energy production, while in the new directive it's more focus on on-site renewable energy production. So what do you think will be the consequence of that?
You want to answer those quickly?
Maybe I should. Okay. I see there's some people who are following EU legislation here too. So. Okay, where does the cost optimal come from? I can give you the short version. What happened is that a lot of industry pushed it very hard because they realized that there was something rotten, they realized that the codes were way off. So they started doing studies, and then they started talking to the commission, and they went to the commissioner Peebles, Energy Commissioner, and they said, Commissioner Peebles, you can't develop EU-wide standards, but can you develop a calculation methodology where you can see if the member states are in the vicinity of having some type of a so-called optimal level? And he said, and he looked at his assistant and said, is that possible? And the assistant said, I think it is. And that was the beginning of it. And he he had a big consultation with industry, and industry was already working in that area. And they said yes. And of course, industry went in and helped a lot and developed some of the calculation methodology, or checked them out, actually on, what do you call it, case studies. They actually applied them on case studies.
Which industry is that?
The insulation industry, my industry was involved partly, but most of the others agreed to it, to all of them. There were a few who were a bit reluctant, but I'd say 3/4 of those working in the construction area liked the idea. And the commission accepted it because it was sort of a compromise. It was hopefully reaching the same thing as setting minimum requirements at EU level, which was impossible, but letting the member states check them, and if they discovered that they were bad, they would be either forced to revise them or to justify to the Commission why they didn't revise them. That's the way it's written. And they put in this 15% as a, France wanted 30%, which is outrageous. But they finally, a compromise was 15. And what they'll do now, to answer your second question, is it's an individual owner of the building. That's the basis for the calculation. And then they would have there is an annex to the directive. It's about 1 page, which gives a pretty clear calculation methodology of what should be included in the cost, the interest, the investment cost, the energy price, even the future energy price, which is a very difficult area. But what they're trying to do is to reach agreement. And now there will be a so-called comitology process where the Commission, together with national experts from each member state, will develop some guidelines. And these will become more or less binding on the member states to use. So it's a process. It's moving toward, I think in time, this may become more than a benchmark. It may become, even when they discussed this directive, there were a lot of people in the Commission who wanted to make this binding, but they didn't succeed. So this was a compromise. The future of certification, I think it moved forward quite a bit in this directive. I think the details of requiring the old directive, the first so-called EPBD, actually there were ways to circumvent a lot of the certification. Like Poland found a way legally, which went to court. They actually tested it in court to, if you sign an agreement with a prospective buyer and seller, you don't need a certificate. And they were doing that in Poland. The Commission found out about it. They took it to court, went to the legal services, and they said, well, the way the directive is written, they can do it. So now they've revised that so you can't get around. You actually have to produce a certificate. So it's things like that which are much tighter. They've tightened the quality of the certifiers a bit. They tried actually to harmonize that, to actually force. What happens in the EU is you've got people certifying buildings, some of who are engineers, mechanical engineers, others who have taken a 2-month course. So it's a different, it needs to be harmonized. That's moving in that direction. As far as renewables, the European Parliament has always loved renewables. So they've included a lot of, they've tried to include a lot of renewables. One thing that I didn't mention is that member states will now, when they build houses, before it said houses over 1,000 square meters should be checked for possible renewables applications. That has been reduced now to 50. So every member state, every house essentially that's going to be built, you have to check for using PV. You have to do a calculation, which is pretty strong for renewable. It's a major, you can discuss the economics of that too, but they are pushing renewables in this directive too.
All right, I think I'm being told by John that in the interest of getting the conference back on schedule,